I was not born under a sky. My people, the Ithari, first shaped thought in the warm pressure folds beneath the living rafts of pelagic tern. We remember not as a line, but as a cord. Every important thing in us is braided from many selves. What we sensed, what our clutch siblings sensed, what our elders impressed into our skin with light and chemical song. Shame has a flavor. Duty leaves a pressure in the bones. Fear is not sharp to us, as it is said to be for some peoples, but wide and cold, like dark water pressing from every direction. For 612 local cycles, that pressure had been the galaxy. The elder powers called their dominion the accord of central balance. To hear the term in translation, one might think it a law. To live beneath it was to know it as appetite arranged into geometry. The Thren held the coreward lanes. They were vast radial beings of cartilage spines and ciliated fronds, each citizen a colony body ruled by a deep ganglion mind. They did not lie often, because they preferred something worse. They stated their intentions with ceremonial clarity and called outrage childish when it came. The Vesk assemblies managed tribute and census through clouds of glittering motes that inhabited grown mineral bodies as temporarily as parasites inhabit carrion. The Raal had no fixed shape at all, only pressure fields within armored vessels, and their judgments came as patterns in magnetics that our translators rendered into legal phrases. Between them and others like them, they fenced the younger species into assigned volumes, stripped promising systems from those who grew too quickly, seized labor, sterilized moons, to correct demographic instability, and burned habitats when examples were required. My species had once spread through 32 reef systems along the outer middle dark. Then the Thren declared our long-range brood arcs a destabilizing vector. 9 systems were reassigned. 4 habitats that refused census integration were open to vacuum. We were confined to 7 stars and taxed in catalysts, wet-grown protein, and archival service. The Ithari endure by remembering in chords, but there are chords too painful to touch. Our children grew in smaller seas, our songs narrowed, we learned to bend. I was hatched into that bent world and trained for the ministry of cross-species record, because Ithari memory was valued by our overseers so long as it served them. I became a translator, then a curator of compliance proceedings, then an attaché assigned to the tribunal anchorage at Sear Belt, where elder powers received petitions from lesser species and informed them, with proper form, why they would not be heard. I believed nothing would ever change, not because I approved. Approval and submission are unrelated states. When the humans arrived, I misfiled them. They came from the outermost dark beyond surveyed worth. From a spiral margin, the Thren considered strategically thin and culturally backward. Their signal forms were crude by central standards, their transit signatures modest, their bodies absurdly fragile-looking. Narrow support columns, soft surfaces, eyes exposed, no shell, no field, no distributed redundancy. They gestured constantly, leaked heat, and used air vibrations as if trust in so imprecise a medium were not a sign of developmental incompletion. They had reached interstellar status without patronage, which was rare but not unheard of. More notable was where they had done it. Almost no new starfaring species emerged so far from the center. The old powers paid attention where value had always been dense. Ancient lanes, resource knots, inheritance zones, regions saturated with prior conquest. The outer rim was treated as wind-scoured vacancy. Things grew there unnoticed until they became irritating. The first human delegation at Sear Belt was small, led by a woman called Ambassador Elena Vale. She had dark fur only on the top of her head, and a face that seemed built for concealment despite its mobility. I remember because the Thren magistrate receiving her displayed full dominance spread, a visual insult usually enough to trigger involuntary submission in younger species, and Vale merely watched as if studying weather. Their case was simple. They had encountered Accord surveyors in territory they considered their own. The Accord had responded by issuing a territorial limitation, confining recognized human sovereignty to a compact wedge of systems despite evidence the humans had explored and seeded infrastructure far beyond it. They were to register all drives above specified yield, surrender autonomous fleet counts, accept inspection, and cease expansion pending review that everyone knew would never conclude. It was the usual beginning. I prepared the record. I expected outrage, then fear, then bargaining. Instead, the humans accepted with a fluency that felt almost indecent. They requested clarifications, transit rights, observer exchange protocols, trade standards, educational access, legal translation matrices. They thanked the tribunal for formal recognition. Vale inclined her head and said humanity wished to be a responsible participant in galactic society. Afterward, in the archive pools, I shared a dry bitter secretion with another Ithari clerk and told her the new species had folded faster than expected. She answered in mourning tone, "Then they may survive." I thought that wise. For a while it appeared true. Human merchants began appearing along secondary routes, trading machine tools, medical substrates, low-cost habitat composites, software architectures surprisingly adaptable to alien interfaces. Their diplomats were courteous. Their officers were disciplined. They accepted inspections too readily. They asked questions no prudent young species should have wasted breath on. Not only how transit tolls were computed, but how enforcement schedules were generated. Not only what weapon classes were banned, but how audit lag was measured across sectors. Not only which systems were restricted, but which relays had maintenance gaps and which policing fleets were chronically underfueled. Humans asked about logistics, the way starving filter feeders ask about currents. I noticed this because I translated for them. Their requests multiplied through every committee where I served: shipping manifests, population movement statutes, anti-piracy patrol jurisdictions. Doctrine papers from 300 cycles ago concerning the pursuit behavior of raw pressure lances. Historical rulings on punitive seizure. They seemed fascinated by the connective tissue of power, not its ceremonial face. Naive diligence, said a Vesk assessor when I remarked upon it, perhaps. Yet some records did not agree with others. Human developmental timelines submitted to the Accord stretched oddly. Metallurgical breakthroughs spaced at intervals too neat to feel natural. Gaps in their pre-contact archives attributed to data loss. Old planetary images with timestamps inconsistent by tiny margins. None of it was enough to accuse. All of it was enough to irritate my pattern sense. More curious still were the absences. Human merchants filed cargoes that arrived late but not missing. Prospecting craft departed recognized space and returned from legal directions with hull dust from places they should not have been. A maintenance tender at Sear Belt carried reactor, shielding far beyond the needs of its declared route. Once, while reconciling port data, I found that 6 human freighters had entered a transfer corridor, and only 4 had emerged on any recognized beacon line, yet no lost claims were filed, no distress pings registered, no inquiry made. The discrepancy vanished after a systems update I had not authorized. We Ithari do not trust vanished things. Absence is a predator's shape, years braided. Human presence thickened in the edges of administration, but not in the center. They built schools, clinics, relay refurbishments in poor systems no elder species valued. They sent legal advisors to younger peoples whose petitions had no chance of success. They bought obsolete wreckage from decommissioned fleets and called it industrial salvage. They never protested loudly when insulted. They remembered every insult. The first time I felt unease, not mere curiosity, was at Hadrick Shoal. The shoal was not human. It belonged to the Narine, a gas-borne species who nested in the upper turbulence of a superjovian and maintained orbital membranes delicate as thought. The VESC assemblies reassigned the world's helium-3 skimming rights to a Thren warbrood for security balancing. The Narine resisted by refusing evacuation. A human relief convoy was present under legal charter, delivering storm-hardened habitats after a magnetosphere failure in a neighboring moon system. I was there as tribunal recorder because the Narine had submitted an emergency plea. The Thren fleet did not negotiate. Their cutters lanced the orbital membranes to force descent. The Narine died in numbers beyond my cord's ability to hold. Their bodies, built for pressure gradients and chemical songs in giant storms, tore apart in hard vacuum and lower atmosphere alike. The human convoy broadcast medical asylum requests and demanded a halt under 3 separate accord provisions. The Thren commander answered, in formal legal mode, that no recognized party of standing was being harmed, and that obstruction of a security transfer was itself destabilizing conduct. A human pilot broke formation and tried to pull survivors from the collapsing membrane clusters. Thren fire cut the rescue ship open. I watched its pressure plume flower against the planet's limb. No retaliation came. The remaining human vessels held position just outside interdiction range, engines burning hot with restraint. I had seen many species made powerless. Their helplessness had a taste. This was not that taste. On the human command channel, the voices were too controlled. Not broken, not panicked, counted, recorded, stored. Later, I encountered Ambassador Vale in a corridor outside the petition chamber. She stood alone, one hand pressed flat against the bulkhead as if steadying herself. Human skin changes color with blood movement. Hers had gone pale around the mouth. "You should leave this case," I told her through my translator membrane. "The record is fixed." She looked at me with those front-facing eyes that made many species uncomfortable. "Is it?" I spread my arm fronds in the Ithari sign for bitter certainty. "This galaxy consumes objections and becomes stronger. Maybe," she said. "Maybe it's been feeding on things that haven't bitten back yet." At the time, I considered it bravado for private use, the kind species produced to protect internal cohesion while accepting public defeat. Still, it left a pressure mark in me. Aggressions followed as if some hidden threshold had been crossed. A human-settled mining world called Glassmere, legally leased inside a mixed jurisdiction zone, was reassigned by tribunal decree to a raw extraction compact after trace exotic matter was found in the system's cometary belt. The humans were ordered to evacuate 40 million residents in 20 days and leave fixed infrastructure intact. When their administrators requested extension for hospitals and dependent populations, the RAL fleet collapsed the planet's orbital elevators anyway, citing delay as noncompliance. Thousands died in the falls and fires. Humanity lodged a protest and completed the evacuation under armed watch. My own people suffered next. On pretext of population drift beyond our confinement quotas, the Thren imposed corrective culling on 2 Ithari broodseas and seized our deep archive caverns at Tel Vero, claiming illicit historical stockpiles. They erased cord vaults older than their own arrival in our region, because memory outside overseer custody was considered strategic instability. I was on Seer Belt when the first images arrived. Burned water, shattered raft cities, hatcheries boiled from orbit into sterile foam. Humans sent aid ships. The tribunal forbade entry. Human ships stopped at the exclusion perimeter and transmitted engineering plans, medical protocols, water purification code, Grief messages translated into our pulse language with painful care. They were ordered to leave. They left. I hated them a little then. Not because they had failed us. Because they had looked like they could have done more, and had chosen not to. That is not a rational emotion. It is still real. Soon after came the suppression at Choir of Dust, where a young machine collective species attempted to disable tribute relays in their own system. The elder response was annihilatory. The Vesk seeded self-replicating corrosion motes through every fabrication cradle on the inhabited moons, turning industry into poison. Human observers were present under development accords. They evacuated children and archival cores until interdiction hit, then withdrew under threat of full fleet engagement. Everywhere this pattern repeated: brutality from the center, human protest, human aid, human restraint. Yet the restraint accumulated strangely, not as exhaustion, as tension. Human diplomats began speaking differently. Less like petitioners, more like witnesses compiling indictment. In committee, they quoted case precedents older species preferred forgotten. They circulated casualty ledgers with names, biosigns, habitat records. They funded legal teams for species too poor to appear in court. They built coalitions among peoples who had never imagined coalition possible, because fear had taught us all to think in isolated wounds. They were still outwardly compliant with their territorial cap, still inspected, still measured, still somehow present in too many places at once. Then humanity asked for a full convocation. The request itself shocked the peripheral ministries. No young species called for doctrinal review of the accord, unless it had mistaken form for substance. I believed, with all the cold width of Ithari caution, that the humans had finally become what I had first assumed them to be: idealistic and doomed. The convocation met at Karin Ring, a neutral station grown around an extinct star's magnetized corpse. I attended as archival relay, one among hundreds from subordinate species permitted to observe but not shape deliberation. Ambassador Vale spoke for humanity. She was older then, silver at the head fur, slower in gesture, more dangerous in stillness. She did not plead. She laid out centuries of confiscations, sterilizations, corrections, exemplary burnings, demographic controls, developmental throttling, seizure doctrines, tribute extractions, punitive occupation patterns. She named species by their dead. She described the accord not as imperfect administration, but as organized predation. She proposed binding sovereignty guarantees for younger civilizations, interdictions on collective punishment, open transit protections, shared enforcement against exterminatory action, and independent review beyond elder monopoly. Many in the chamber recoiled not at the cruelty described, but at the violation of expected tone. The Thren fronds flared with affront. The Ra vessel wells pulsed in hostile harmonics. The Vesk motes condensed into dense glitter around their speaker body, a sign of predatory attention. A lesser species does not accuse. It requests, it thanks, it adapts. Vale finished by saying, "Power without limit has made you incapable of moral scale." That ends one way or another. Silence struck the chamber. Even we observers folded in on ourselves. My people do not often use the term impossible, because the universe delights in making fools of rigid minds. But I remember thinking, she has killed them all. The elder reply came in forms both legal and immediate. Humanity was censured for destabilizing rhetoric, trade privileges suspended, inspectors expanded, mixed jurisdiction holdings reviewed for reassignment, human-aligned aid charters frozen. Several younger species that had publicly endorsed the human proposals were punished within days, as if to cauterize the idea of common cause. And then came the exemplary blow. The world was called harborside in human usage, An old station cluster and terraformed moon in the inner corridors, densely inhabited by civilians, diplomats, traders, and refugees under formal guarantees. Humans had built it in a poor system no elder power had valued until it became useful as a symbol. It was too far inward to be defended quickly from the human outer territories everyone thought constituted the true limit of their strength. The Thren and Vesk announced a joint enforcement action for concealed weapons violations. No evidence was presented. Human appeals were denied in under an hour. I was in the records chamber at Sear Belt when the feeds began. Orbital forts disabled the station lattice. Vesk motes 8 power grids from inside. Thren bombardment vessels opened the moon's atmosphere with targeted thermal strikes, not enough to crack the crust, just enough to turn cities and shelters into furnaces. Escape traffic was held in local space and destroyed selectively in public, so there would be witnesses. Formal notices were transmitted throughout the killing, citing restoration of balance. 300 million died over 11 hours. I watched because I was tasked to authenticate the record. My people believe that if suffering is not remembered accurately, it reproduces itself without resistance. Yet there are accuracies one never stops drowning in. Human channels filled the emergency bands with call signs, hospital identifiers, family names, medevac routes, prayers in languages I did not know. Then the feeds cut out one by one. Around me, elder staff resumed procedure after the last heat bloom faded. It was astonishingly normal. Cases moved. Seals were stamped. I understood then that the horror of the old order was not only what it did, but how little of itself it spent in doing it. I expected human collapse. If not submission, then rage without leverage, terror, fragmentation. Instead, there was silence. It began in places too small to mark. A human commercial office on Sear Belt closed for indefinite restructuring. A teaching mission departed Ulvo's reach. 3 human freighters aborted dockings and never refiled. At Karin Ring, the human delegation vacated its quarters, leaving data stacks wiped so clean it was almost an insult. Advisors embedded with lesser species sent concise farewells or nothing at all. Relief stations run by humans transferred stores to local caretakers and powered down. Long-haul traffic from the outer dark fell off a cliff, channels went unanswered, trade instruments froze. Human neighborhoods emptied in frightening order, no panic, no visible scramble. They just withdrew. The elders celebrated too early. Commentary spread that the punitive action had restored perspective. Young species whispered instead. Something in the quiet felt wrong. This was not the shattering of a people. It was a lung filling. Then the Thren launched their punitive expedition. They assembled a centerward battle web large enough to erase any ordinary peripheral state. Brood carriers, fracture lances, relay hunters, occupation barges. The official objective was seizure of core human systems, permanent inspection architecture, and selective demographic correction. They expected token resistance, perhaps mines, perhaps local fanaticism. The route projected toward humanity's recognized wedge on the outer edge. Through sparse lanes the Accord had always considered strategically trivial. I was aboard the Ithari service tender bound memory, attached as archival liaison to a logistics chain behind the expedition. Our species had no choice. Auxiliaries never do. At first there was only absence, then relay blackout. Then something impossible happened to distance. Human strikes hit the vanguard before the expedition reached the first recognized border bastion. Not raiders, fleet actions. Coordinated assaults emerging from vectors the charts marked as empty, using transit behavior our models had not considered achievable. Thren scouts vanished entire. Sensor ghosts became warships. Minefields unfolded after the fleet had passed through them, cutting retreat lanes with machine precision. The first capital brood carrier died trying to rotate broadside against contacts that had crossed 3 light weeks of interdicted dark in less time than our warning nets required to agree on a threat. It did not explode in the way old weapons caused. It came apart in nested silence, internal fields collapsing section by section, as if some invisible hand had reached in and turned agreement into contradiction. Later, I would learn humans had spent decades studying how elder systems coordinated power across distributed structures and had built weapons to make those systems fight themselves. At the time, it looked like sorcery grown from mathematics. Human formations did not behave like central fleets. They dispersed, rejoined, and reconfigured faster than command assumptions allowed. Their ships were modular, heavily automated, and linked through communication architectures resilient against every jamming doctrine the elders trusted. They struck relay hubs first, fuel stores second, command nodes third. They killed vision, then mobility, then choice. More terrifying than their weapons was their preparation. The outer dark was not empty. It was full of them. Stations hidden in comet shadows, lit up by the hundreds. Shipyards buried in rogue planet ice shed camouflage and began vomiting escorts, tenders, drone swarms, fuel trains, hospital ships. Whole industrial chains emerged from regions the Accord had never mapped closely because nothing important was supposed to happen there. Humanity's compliance had been a curtain. Behind it, they had built depth beyond anything a contained species should possess. And still, that was not the whole of it. As the punitive expedition broke, signals went out across the subordinate worlds. Some were open declarations. Some were keys humans had seeded years earlier through aid programs, legal networks, trade systems, educational exchanges. They did not command rebellion, they made it possible. On Ithari worlds, hidden transmitters awakened in our old archive caves, carrying backups of the cord vaults the Thren had erased and evidence of every confiscation and culling preserved by human partners who had asked, years before, oddly specific questions about our dead. On Narine refuges, human weather platforms unfolded into defense grids. At Choir of Dust, the machine collectives used code once gifted by developmental consultants to purge VESC corrosion from surviving fabs and turn them back on. On a dozen tribute worlds, labor habitats revolted the same day because human logistics maps had quietly circulated through black channels, showing exactly where occupation fleets were weakest and how long reinforcements would take if the relays were cut. I returned to Pelagic Turn under emergency release to find my people no longer bent. Ithari rebellion does not look like human rebellion. We do not shout, we synchronize. Entire broodseas shifted pulse in a single night. Archive keepers opened forbidden memory cords to the young. Service guilds poisoned the census streams. Navigation priests rewrote current maps for Thren troop barges, sending them into dead gravitic folds. Our swimmers infiltrated the mooring guts of occupation stations and seeded them with shaped corrosives tuned to the Thren's cartilage chemistry. For the first time in my life, elder enforcers entered our waters and did not leave. Human contact resumed not as paternal command, but as coordination. Their officers asked what we could hold, not what we could offer. Their fleets punched corridors through the dark and left root defense nodes for local militias to man. They shared manufacturing templates stripped to principles we could adapt to our own biologies and industries. They published evidence of elder atrocities system by system, not for vengeance alone, but to break the last spell of inevitability. The war spread inward like a truth arriving late. Elder species tried to rally the galaxy. They broadcast the old language of stability, warning that human aggression would dissolve civilization into chaos. Too many of us had seen Harborside burn. Too many had watched our young culled, our worlds capped, our futures trimmed to fit central convenience. The myth of elder invincibility had been the ligament holding their order together. Once severed, everything tore. Human power became overwhelming not in one miraculous stroke, but by multiplication. Every subject species that defected gave them guides, repair yards, local intelligence, safe harbors, fighters who knew exactly where old tyrannies hid their arteries. And the humans had planned for that too. Their command nets absorbed difference instead of crushing it. Their war did not require us to become copies of them. I served then as more than recorder. Bound Memory joined a liberation flotilla pushing toward Tel Varro, where our archive caverns had been seized generations earlier and turned into a Thren coordination vault. I translated surrender demands. I authenticated occupation records as they were captured. When the final defense web around the caverns collapsed under human bombardment, so precise it cracked every weapons node without flooding the deep chambers, I entered with Ithari reclaimers and found our old memory walls still scarred from elder cutting. A human marine stood aside to let us pass first. That gesture, small as it was, struck me harder than grand victory. Conquerors see symbolic places for themselves. Liberators know when not to stand in the center. The war ended in stages. Some elder polities fought to extinction. Others fragmented when their subject servitors abandoned them. A few attempted negotiations only after their fleet cores were gone and their punitive instruments disabled. Humanity accepted surrenders, imposed disarmament, dismantled the strategic monopolies that had made collective terror possible, and established enforcement structures no single species could own alone. Elder worlds were not exterminated. Their populations were not culled in return. Their expansion was contained, their war industries partitioned, their archives opened, their crimes recorded before all. Many among my people had expected that victory would merely invert the hierarchy. We had lived too long to imagine power without appetite. But the humans had not fought to become the new center. Perhaps they understood too well what centers become when unchallenged. The new compact dispersed transit authority, inspection rights, and fleet oversight across many civilizations. No species, including humanity, could unilaterally cap another's growth, seize whole worlds by doctrine, or hold relief hostage to obedience. Enforcement required coalition. Archives were made redundant across incompatible custodians, so truth could not be neatly burned again. There were arguments, failures, fear, vengeance killings in places too wounded to recover cleanly. Freedom is not a smooth substance, it has edges. The dead did not return. Harborside remained ash and orbital wreckage, a grave visible from 3 approach lanes. Hadrick Shoal still whispered with naring losses in the thin upper storms. My own chord would never be free of Tel Varro's erased songs. Yet for the first time in my life, the future no longer felt pre-written by stronger mouths. I was present at the first open remembrance held at Sear Belt after its tribunal chambers were converted into a common court. The old insignia had been stripped from the walls. Delegates from species once forbidden even to address one another, without permission stood in the same light. A human representative spoke briefly of the war's cost, then yielded the floor to survivors from worlds not their own. When my turn came, I tried to explain what humanity had done in terms my people would understand. Not simply that they were strong. Strength alone had belonged to our oppressors too. Not simply that they had won, victory can curdle. I said that the humans had entered a galaxy built on learned helplessness and had recognized the structure of the trap at once. They had hidden their growth as a reef creature hides bone under soft flesh. They had endured humiliation without teaching themselves to love it. They had watched, measured, remembered, and when the moment came, they had struck not as raiders or avengers drunk on pain, but as a species that had decided terror was an engineering problem and tyranny a system that could be broken. Afterward, Ambassador Vale found me in the corridor where I had once warned her that records were fixed. She was very old then, carried partly by a discreet exoskeletal support under her formal clothing, but her eyes were unchanged. "Was I wrong?" she asked. I tasted the air, remembering Hadrick Shoal, Harborside, Tel Vero, the silent withdrawal before the storm. "About the record," I said. "Yes," she smiled, but only with sadness. "Good, now I keep the liberated archives of pelagic turn. Human children sometimes visit our memory pools, with students from species that would once have met only as tribute payers and enforcers. They are noisy, curious, irreverent creatures. They ask how we survived so long under fear. My people answer as honestly as we can, badly, then better, then together. At the edge of our restored sea vault hangs a shard of hull glass recovered from Harborside. It catches the filtration light and throws it through the water in broken bands. The young swim through those bands and do not flinch. I was born believing the galaxy was a pressure no one could resist. I have lived long enough to feel that pressure break. And when I remember the first humans I saw at Sear Belt, small, soft, peripheral, seemingly courteous to the point of weakness, I understand at last what I failed to recognize. They were not accepting their place in the old order. They were measuring the cage.